Well, thanks. I am very happy to be here. This is a personal story that I'm going to tell because this was my agency. This is my agency, Butler, Shine, Stern and Partners. And we're in the midst of management transition and succession. And it is an incomplete story. So it's not something that I can necessarily tell you is complete or finished yet, but I can tell you in process how we've gone about doing it and what we've done right, we think, and what we've done wrong over the years. So this is the agenda. I am the successee. David Eastman, current CEO of BSSP, is the successor. And we're going to talk about lessons learned and principles for success, except we is not we is me. Because the best laid plans, the successor is not here, because the current CEO has to be in an important client meeting. And that's part of succession. I don't need to be in that meeting anymore. I'm co-chair. CEO has to be in that meeting. I'm going to try to do his perspective on succession as well as I can do my perspective on succession. So we'll see how that goes. First, I want to talk a little bit about succession because no one wants to talk about succession. Because succession is about death. It's like death because no one wants to talk about it. Why? Because it's acknowledging your own death. It's acknowledging that someone can be as good or better in your job than you. No one wants to talk about succession. I'm going to try to talk about it here, and as I said, including some of the things we didn't do very well. But first, I want to give you a little bit of background. BSSP is a 25-year-old agency. We are an independent agency. That means we own the agency. The founders own the agency. In fact, the majority is owned by the remaining founders, John Butler and myself. We've also begun to distribute equity among other principals, as well as our successors, and I'll get to that in a second. Interestingly, for our 25 years, we are a loosely structured agency. We have never, to this day, had a VP amongst our current 100 people, previously 150 people, previously 20 people. We're very loosely structured. That made for very specific challenges when it came to thinking about succession. First thing I want to do, though, is show a reel for two reasons. One, it's a very short reel, it's a sizzle reel, to give you an idea of our clients and the type of work that we do at BSSP, but also because we're at an advertising conference. And if we don't show the work at an advertising conference, then what is it we're actually talking about?
Me, Ryan Lochte, from swimming. Don't that feel real funky, y'all? Let's do this, America.
Pull.
Oh, thank you. So from the background, you know a little bit about BSSP. We have a legacy. I've been talking at various venues about succession, and I always talk about legacy. There are two sides to legacy. One is what I would almost call the pejorative. For 25 years, we've been doing things a certain way. There are certain processes. There are certain values. There's a certain culture. Some of it is very positive. Some of the things might be holding us back. There are certain people that are legacy people who've just always been there, and their salaries climbing as well. The other side of legacy, which is a very positive one, is seen in that reel, is seen in the awards, is seen in the fact that last year, in our 25th year, we were named Ad Agency's Best Small Agency of the Year, which is something that we're very, very proud of. So there's legacy in reputation, there's legacy in recognition, but there's also legacy in all those things, all that baggage that you've brought around with you schlepped around for 25 years. So this, in Succession, is really a story of trying to preserve the latter, the good parts of legacy, while shedding the former. A little bit of history of BSSP. At 15 in 2009, we thrived in a global recession. We were doing great. We thought that we could beat the odds and we could buck all the trends, and we were just going to continue at our 25% margins and retention of people and awards and everything else. Well, at 20, we felt the effects of the industry, and all of the industry headwinds that we know about began to catch up with us. And I don't need to go through those: increased competition and projects versus retainers, and people moving and choosing technology platforms, et cetera. This is a metaphor with the great white shark off of out in San Francisco Bay. This is for two things. One, what began to affect the industry and the headwinds, but also one thing that I wanted to talk about very briefly as an independent agency, M&A. So over the 25 years, representatives from every one of your companies has called us at one point or the other, and either they've walked away from us or we've walked away from them, usually with good reason on both sides. I will say today, at 25, that our independence is probably our greatest asset. And just as an aside, while we talk about our independence, what I have to say about Succession might not be relevant to many of you who are with holding company-owned agencies. There are some independents in here, but some of the lessons learned in terms of what we've done right, perhaps some of the things to avoid, will also have relevance. But it's not necessarily, as you talk about succession, founder succession, succession to the founders. It might be succession to a long line of managers that have been developed after the founder was gone 100 years ago. Anyway, I wanted to talk about M&A for a second because having received those phone calls from literally day one, we figured we'd sell. And if you sell, you don't really need to worry about succession. That's somebody else's problem. But then in the end, we chose that was not what our path. If it happens in the future, it happens in the future. But that was not the path we were going to take. We were going to find successors either internally or externally and keep the legacy of BSSP alive. So I mentioned industry headwinds. With the industry headwinds and the 25% margins being reduced and attrition increasing, both client and individual, and all of the other things that we as an industry are facing, we decided that we needed to address a couple things. Number one, find the successors. Number two, figure out how we actually transfer the equity to them over time. That led to the question, who's next? When I first sent a draft of this presentation around to David Eastman, my successor, who is a Brit, his comment was simply that this was the Who's best album ever. And he was actually right about that. But it's certainly an appropriate image to find out, actually to discover who would be next. So we looked internally and we began to look externally in order to define a succession plan and an internal transfer of equity. Those were the two things that we figured we needed. So the first thing we did, we created structure. As you recall, I said this was a loosely structured company. There are no VPs, titles were not that important, everybody sort of got along, we figured out who was reporting to who, and we figured that if we were actually going to identify people internally and begin to transfer equity to them, we needed to actually create some form of structure. So that looked, in its simplest form, something like this: owners and executive management, executive directors, there were 6 of them, and that consisted primarily of heads of departments, and directors, and then obviously there were sort of rank and file below them. And we figured that among the executive directors, we would find the next generation of owners of BSSP, as well as the next generation of leaders, the next CEO, the next CCO. But what we found was that things weren't going so well. We literally had meetings where we were handing the keys and saying, we're handing the keys to you, group of 6. We need you to help figure this out. We need you to help win business, decide what we pitch, decide what are the plans that we need in terms of new services, new talent, et cetera. And we weren't winning. In fact, we were losing business. And we were trying to figure out, what, you guys have the keys to the kingdom. You have the power. We have appointed you, anointed you as our future successors. What's the problem? They kept saying, you're too involved. You're way too involved. We said, we're not going to pitches anymore. We're not in all these meetings. We're not reviewing and managing the creative necessarily. What could be the problem? What we discovered, and it took a consultant, which the pigeon represents, to help us figure out, was having been at this company, at this point it was 23 years, having founded the company, there was a informal, paternalistic environment that had been established, and one that was certainly not intentional. If I was in the room and my mouth was shut, people wouldn't speak because they'd want to know what I was going to say. Or they would say something that they thought would please me. So when they said, you're too involved, it wasn't about what we said, it was that we were even there. So just as an aside, with succession in place now, in fact, I just realized what you were trying to tell me, move my cell phone, right? Thank you, I'm so sorry about that. As I heard the little buzzing. We've now, John Butler and I have moved from our offices in the center of the space to a former conference room way off to the side. So literally, although we are there less, our presence is not felt, and the paternalistic notion that was inadvertent is no longer a factor. So we brought in a consultant, and we asked the consultant to do a few things. We said, this was the brief or the remit for the consultant. Assess our positioning, our capabilities, and our talent. In other words, are we future-proofed? Is BSSP 25 years in, formed as, I will remind you, a traditional agency in 1994, and acquired a digital agency in 2003, and acquired other companies and integrated all that in. Are we ready for the present state of advertising and for what clients need? And do we have the people for that? Can you help us identify successors? And can you help give us the framework for an orderly, over time transfer of equity? So we brought in a consultant. They did a great job. There was a ton of interviews, both internal and external interviews. And the findings were this. Number one, you have a legacy. Well, there's that word again. And the legacy, again, was a double-sided word. You have old ways of doing things, you have old ways of approaching things, but you also have a fantastic reputation in the market. People are rooting for you, you're getting invited to the right pitches, you're converting some of those pitches, you're winning awards, you're getting that recognition, but you're still, in some ways, that traditional agency, even though you're doing all this digital work, all this social work, et cetera. So we had the double-sided legacy, and in fact, there were some internal successors. That was another finding. Not what we thought, though. There were two executive creative directors, one of whom was deemed to be a potential successor for my partner, John Butler. And lo and behold, and very surprising to me, there was no successor internally for me. That was a huge surprise. We always just assumed that either this person or that person was going to be my successor. And that person, as it turned out, did not exist at BSSP. The other thing that this consultant provided, and they did an excellent job with this, was provide a framework for an orderly transfer of equity over time. And I'm going to get into that later again. Some of this does not necessarily apply particularly to the publicly traded or holding company-owned agencies, but the notion of providing incentives, whether through equity or phantom equity or something like that, actually does apply, and that's critical in this. And so began, with our group of 6 executive directors still in place, the first search, which was for a new CEO, my successor. At which point the executive directors, particularly the ones who thought, wait a minute, I thought we had one in-house, started scratching. I've been here 15 years. Well, that doesn't mean that you have the skill set or the confidence of your peers to be my successor, to be the next CEO. So this was a challenge. What was I looking for? What were we looking for? Specifically a leader, someone with a track record in running a company, someone who is a decision maker, someone with a track record of winning business, I should say. Importantly, a digital native. So again, if you think about the flip side of legacy and the flip side of someone who'd been with us for 15 years, they might be very fluent in digital, but they still spent their last 15 years at what had started as a traditional agency, and it's difficult to adjust the values without a new, fresh way of thinking. We wanted someone who wants to be an owner. A lot of people want to be an owner. It's very different than acting like an owner. Acting like an owner is every expense is monitored, every expense is checked. Acting like an owner is the late nights that you're all putting in, even if you're not owners. Sorry about that. But acting like an owner is taking everything personally because this is the company that you own, that you built, et cetera, whether your name is on the door or not. This was the CEO brief. And I found a fellow named David Eastman. Here are his credentials, clearly qualified. He is a digital native. He, in fact, started a company in the UK that was acquired by Agency.com, leading him to become the global CEO of Agency.com. He has some relationship to the 4A's, having been on the board, also on the AEF and the Ad Council, working at Saatchi. He was global head of digital of JWT before he was CEO of North America for JWT. So I found David, and I continued to search, and I continued to search, and I continued to search. And we realized that we actually had someone very, very qualified who was available, who was interested, whose partner is a senior executive at Facebook and could do her work from the Bay Area as easily as in New York. And so we brought David out from New York to San Francisco. Well, what happened? Of the 6 executive directors at BSSP, 1 remains. And these are people who were with us anywhere from 10 to 18 years. I'm not proud about that, but I also don't regret it. We needed that complete overhaul and turnover in order to think differently, approach differently, and most importantly, never say or think, and this is true of any mature organization, oh, that's the way we've always done it. Because if that is ever the answer or the thought, it's the wrong answer, especially in the environment that we're working in today. So the first thing David had to deal with me, with John Butler, was the attrition, which from his perspective was even more okay than from my perspective because he wanted to build his own team, of course, particularly at the top. So this is the point where I take over for David Eastman. I hand him the clicker, his mic comes on, and he talks about taking over from founders. And I'm going to try, he sent me his notes, and I'm going to try to do it as best I can. But specifically, one of the points that he wanted to make is it's different succeeding a founder whose name is on the door, who has an emotional attachment to the company, who might have been there for 25 years, than it is from working for a holding company-owned agency and taking over from the person who was there for the last 3 to 5 years or 10 years. But it's different, and in particular, the difference is the emotional attachment. And so what that requires is a certain emotional connection between the successor and the successee to make sure that while there is a willingness to move into new directions that perhaps hadn't been executed before or even thought about before, there's also a respect, not for the past, but for the legacy, for what we have achieved, for what we have built. So that raises the EQ component. How do you actually make sure that there is that simpatico, that there is respect from the successor's point of view for what we have built, for certain cultural aspects that you want to retain, while a willingness from the successee's point of view to change and to say goodbye to people who've been with us for 15 years, which, as was noted in the Publicist's health presentation and discussion, that's one of the hardest things ever to do. But so that EQ component is actually is quite important. Being a custodian of the brand. As a CEO, the CEO is the custodian of the brand. The CEO in an advertising agency is managing the balance between creativity and commerce. So if you're custodian of the brand, what are the elements of the brand that you want to keep? What is that legacy that you want to take forward? And importantly, as David put it, transcends the names on the door, transcends the reputations, and importantly, the presence of the founders, that actually allows BSSP to stand for something greater than what John, Mike, and I originally started and what John and I continued to build for many years since. Very importantly, and probably David's biggest task every day, how do you modernize a 25-year-old agency? Now, as I said, we got modern through acquisition, buying a digital company, buying a design firm, et cetera. But at the end, we still were an agency that was founded in 1994. As David put it in what he was going to say, we went from, not BSSP, the industry, from Friendster to MySpace to Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat in 15 years. And BSSP was around for 10 years before that. So how do you modernize that type of a company where there are certain things that are constant? The importance of a creative idea, the importance of a brilliant creative idea in helping solve our clients' problems, but the need to express that, to develop it differently in a much more agile and fast fashion and nimble fashion, but also the importance of expressing it through multiple channels. The ability to understand the difference of a piece of content that will be going out in social channels versus your Super Bowl spot, which, by the way, you're still making. And then, of course, managing change. And in particular, in managing change, we're talking about attrition. And we're talking about the people who say BSSP isn't what it was. Well, no, because it can't be. And the industry wasn't what it was. And if we don't change it, if we don't try to stay ahead of the times, let alone keep up with them, then we're not going to be around for the next 10 or 25 years. So managing change is absolutely critical, and encouraging change and not being afraid of it. Everybody reacts to change in a different way. There are those who say it's too fast, there are those who say that it's too slow, but no one really wants it because it is threatening. And the most important thing, particularly when we are aggressively seeking change, is to actually embrace it and realize we're going to get some aspects of it wrong, whether it's the wrong hire, someone who might be wrong for culture, or a wrong change in process, but you need to move on and you need to continually evolve and adapt. Speaking of evolving culture, what are the elements of the culture of BSSP that you want to keep? What are the elements of culture that you want to shed and not carry around and not carry on? One of the things that I took away from this conference, and I haven't been able to sit in everything, but a common theme has been the notion of not allowing managers to interview incoming candidates unless they've been trained in unconscious bias. That's great. That's amazing. Now, not every agency can train every person responsible for interviewing in unconscious bias, but what an amazing thing to build into the culture. One of the elements of our culture, which I am ready to shed, and we have begun to, is we kept hiring the same people, particularly in the creative department. We hired people whose books looked like John Butler's and Mike Schein's books because those were great books. Why wouldn't you hire those people? The problem is you're just continually doing the same work. So that's just one personal example, but the point is to find the elements of culture that you want to keep, that you want to sustain, that helped make us, I'll toot our own horn for a second, one of the best places to work in the country, named by Outside Magazine for 5 years in a row, taking advantage of all the wonderful things, some of the wellness elements of the Bay Area, and incorporating those into employee benefits, a lot of the activities that we participate in together. How do you keep those? How do you keep the importance of creativity? How do you shed some of the things that were holding us back, whether it was the type of people that we were hiring or the siloing of data analytics? We were an early creative agency with data analytics. We continue to have it, but they were over there. They were assessing how the campaign did. They weren't bringing insight into the development of the campaign, and that's a new way of working, and that's a change in culture. The first task for David, and one of the hardest, was finding a creative partner. So I mentioned that the consultant who came in and said that of the two ECDs, one of the ECDs was John's potential successor. Well, when David came in, that potential successor hightailed it out of there. He wasn't the person that he came in to work for. So he moved down to LA with his family, got a nice big job. That left one ECD. And that ECD said, I've been here 15 years, you owe this to me. Yeah, you didn't keep that account, and you haven't won that, and you're a great writer, but you're not a leader of people. Oh, you owe this to me. Again, one of the hardest decisions. We did not let him go. We wanted that person to stay. He left, and he left with a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and he's probably thriving and making more and happier in his freelance role than he ever was with us. In any case, David put out the brief. We had 2 different headhunters working on it, and we ended up with a fantastic hire, which I will get to in a second. But this has been one of the most important things. Matt Curry, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him in a minute. He has been with us 6 months. David has been with us a year and a half. The two of them have been running the agency together for 6 months. And as David said in his notes to me, and I was glad to have this affirmation, John and I have kept up our part of the bargain. We have stayed uninvolved. David meets with me at his suggestion weekly. He and Matt have put together a Google Doc that we can check in on at any time to find out what's going on. They are handling all pitches. They are handling all clients. John and I are, in some ways, figuring out what to do with ourselves, how we can contribute to the evolved culture. And I'll give you some specific examples of that as well, such as founders' lunches with new employees, onboarding with new employees, doing talks like this, presence in the press, thought leadership articles in the trade press, things like that. Finding that new creative partner was absolutely key. So we now have a leadership team that has been in place for 6 months. And in a 25-year-old agency where we had people who had been with us, in some cases for 20 plus years, certainly for 10 and 15 years, each of those two new leaders were found outside, which is not what we had expected going in. And the final note, and I would agree with this again is David's slide, so far so good. We're winning some business. We are certainly getting some recognition as well. And the people that we're bringing in and that we're attracting because of the proposition going forward with David and Matt are great. And this is part of managing change and evolving culture. We're now hiring and have the opportunity to hire account people from RGA, creative teams from Facebook, data analytics people from platform companies as opposed to just from agencies. So we're bringing in the type of talent that we think will actually carry the company forward in a very positive way. So the CCO brief, not surprisingly, mirrored in many ways the CEO brief. Specifically, we're looking for a strong leader, a decision maker. I heard a very interesting thing yesterday on the stage, or I think it was yesterday, that an introvert certainly has a lot going on and can also be a strong leader. And I agree with that 100%. But they have to demonstrate the leadership skills as well. The reason I bring that up is one of the potential successees is a quiet man, and he said, there are quiet leaders. And we said, we know, absolutely. Sadly, the unstated was, you're not necessarily one of them. But in any case, we were looking for a strong leader and a decision maker, someone with a strong new business track record, known award-winning work, a digital track record, again, wants to be an owner, more importantly, acts like an owner, very importantly, attracts talent with the need to rebuild the creative department, and also someone who's good with clients. I don't know if you, as particularly all the talent officers out there, have found there are great writers and great art directors and great designers in your creative department. Not all of them are great with clients, and some of them don't really want to be, and that's fine as well. But it's recognizing those qualities, particularly when you're hiring a chief creative officer. So this is Matt Curry. His background was Ogilvy, AKQA, David and Goliath. He was at 72 and Sunny most recently. He worked overseas, career-defining work for Google, Activision, and Starbucks, lots of recognition. Here's what I love most about Matt Curry, is how he got into the business. He did not go to one of the schools. He was traveling. He was in Asia. He was writing travel articles in Asia. He decided he wanted to stay in Asia, and in China specifically, so he got a job with Ogilvy. He did not come from the factory. He was not trained by the same people. He figured it out himself as a way to facilitate a particular lifestyle, put together a great book, and therefore a great resume as well. I want to talk briefly about internal equity transfer. Again, it is less relevant to the to the holding company owned agencies, but it still, I think, is relevant in terms of figuring out, well, what does that mean in particular for John and me? What does that mean? How do you incentivize the next generation of leadership? We created something called B shares. I'm going to keep it very, very simple, but the short story is A shares are the original founder shares. They started at a valuation of $0, which was the valuation of the company when we started. B shares start at the level, the valuation of the company when Matt and David started. This was an estimated valuation. If we ever sell, their shares will receive the benefit of from the valuation of when they started to the valuation at when we sell. However, it gives them the opportunity for profit distributions from zero. So if they have 2%, and their 2% of the company is in B shares, and we make a distribution, they get a full 2% of that profit distribution. So they have great incentive to make the company profitable, and they have great incentive to grow the company. That is the very high-level version of the equity transfer scheme. A little bit more detail is with their profit distributions, they will have money to pay us to buy A shares over time. So that's in short how it works. It keeps them motivated. It gives us the opportunity to actually get some value for our equity and is a longer-term play to keep them with us. So with that, before we go to questions, I wanted to give you what I would call high-level tips for effective succession planning. The first one is start early. Again, referring to the Publicis Health discussion, they started 2 years early. We started too late. And one of the reasons we started too late is because of what I was discussing before, which is the loosely structured company. We always thought we'd be there. You view yourself as younger than you are, all of those things. And although we had discussions with some of the people in that executive director group, and certainly once they were in the group, we did not establish the criteria for them to take over. If you do this, then we see you as the next CEO or CCO. Identify backup, because it might not be the person that you think it is. He or she might not achieve the criteria that you've set out. Or they might say, this is not for me. I don't want to be an owner. I'd rather collect my salary. Don't commit until proven. So establish that criteria, measure against the criteria, and then make the commitment. We have a wrap. I learned recently, having lunch with a recruiter, I said, what do people think of us? And in particular, in relation to this succession. And apparently there is a wrap that we promised, in particular the CCO position, to a number of people that were internal. This person said it was promised to them. This person said it was promised to them. This person said it was promised to them. I never promised it to him. John never promised it to him. They assumed, I've been here 15 years. I've been here 10 years. It was never said, if you do these things, you will have that position. Provide incentives, especially when you have the succession going on. And I mentioned what those are in terms of equity and in terms of profit distribution. Clear, measurable outcomes. The profit distribution and the equity distribution to our successors are based on revenue growth, margin growth. It's as simple as that. I mean, we can tie that to client wins, but in the end, unless we have wins and retention, we're not going to have that growth, the financial growth. Think about whether it's internal or external. Again, this applies to everybody. It isn't necessarily, that person is not necessarily in your organization at the moment. You might think they are, but until that is proven, until the criteria is established and he or she has met that, you won't know if they are. So always keep the option open that you might be looking externally, particularly if the organization is in need of change, as we were, and understand why. There might be a very good reason to look outside. And this is very important. Define the successee's role. That role can be, if they play golf, go play golf. That role can be, go do yoga 5 times a week. That role can be, go on the speaking circuit. That role can be, write articles. But be sure to define the role both internally and externally, particularly if the successee, especially if it's a founder, is staying on. Often, particularly in the holding company-owned organizations, successor comes in, their predecessor is out. So it's not really an issue to deal with. But in our case, that was actually a very important one. And then just a couple words of wisdom, and this is more salient to founder succession stories. 1, walk away within reason. And that is the hardest thing for John and me to have done, but we have done it. And the other is show faith. If we express doubt in the halls about David or about Matt, we have completely crushed the organization. If we want to express doubts to them, that's another story. but expressing doubts externally or internally beyond them, you cannot do that. Once you've made the commitment, you absolutely have to show faith. So thank you very much. I've included my contact info. I've included David's as well. Should you be interested in finding out if what I said was true, feel free to reach out to him.
First of all, here's your phone.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Now I know what he was.
Indeed. First of all, I like that last one, show faith. All too often in organizations, you find stuff is percolating externally, can do significant damage, so I totally hear you. Thank you, Greg, for your terrific perspective around succession planning. At a founder-led independent agency, there are clearly some similarities and differences from succession planning at an agency within a network, like a Publicis Health, and we heard this morning. And you did an excellent job of playing the role of David, so cheers to you on that front. I'm going to try and get one or two questions in. I know that we're tight on time, but I definitely want to get a question in. So it says, today is the first day of Women's History Month. Your founders, John, Mike, and Greg, hired David and Matt. Was there a considerable or consideration for women or people of color?
So Mike had nothing to do with it. He's been out of the agency for 5 years, just to clarify that. But let's tackle the first question and the last question. They're certainly absolutely relevant. I'm going to tackle them by saying we failed. Of course it was a consideration. It was more than a consideration. You heard me say that I had David in hand, and I continued to look, and I continued to look. I can tell you very specific stories, not only briefs with recruiters, and by the way, is Claire in the room? If there are any recruiters in the room, the first priority in any brief today is diversity, gender and racial diversity. And then they say, get in line, and then they say, we don't have a pipeline. We actually had a bit of a pipeline. I found a woman in Los Angeles who was absolutely perfect. We were ready to hire her. She pulled out of consideration because she was going through a bitter divorce and would have lost custody of her child. Found a woman in New York who was very good. I wouldn't say we were as ready to hire her. It was more of a stretch in terms of her experience. She wanted to come back to the Bay Area. Her mother lived there. She said, I can't do this because I want to have another kid and I can't devote the time that's required. At that point, I called a trusted female advisor to me, someone who I'd worked with as an executive coach. And I said, what should I do? I've got this individual who I'm going to lose. I've been keeping him warm for about 4 months. He's a white male. He is more than qualified. I have 2 female candidates, each of whom dropped out for very good reasons. I can put this search on hold or continue it for another 6 to 12 months to try to find the elusive female or person of color, or I can hire David. And she and other people who I trust said, you should hire the individual. When it came to Matt's search, that was top of the list. We had 2 candidates presented by 2 different headhunters that represented gender diversity or racial diversity. Neither of them, and I'm not going to go into details on those, were right for the job. We failed. I mean, there's no other way for me to put it except we failed. And the only potential solve for that is to surround them as we build the ranks of talent at a senior level and throughout with diverse candidates, with diverse talent. It's as simple as that. And it's a huge issue that faces the industry. It's one that you can tell I am passionate about, that I'm doing my best within the 4A's role and at BSSP to tackle. And it is systemic and it is endemic. And I appreciate the question. And there's no question that we should have been called on it.
But I think you also hit it right on the head. It's about perhaps developing that next tier of leadership so that therefore you do have that pipeline that's available. Mm-hmm. Right. Changes translated into loss of legacy leaders, either voluntary or not. But how has that impacted the rest of the agency regarding their role and security?
I'm not quite sure what the idea is behind the question, but it has impacted. If I'm interpreting this correctly, we have legacy leaders and they are feeling less secure and they need to prove themselves with the new leadership above them that they can get on board and push the agency in the direction that Matt and David have defined and continue to make that progress. I think that addresses that question, I hope. In any case, thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention and the opportunity to speak. Thank you so much.